Yes, with support with very strong reservations, Mr. Speaker.
Please proceed.
You know, we all come to this building because we've been motivated by something very strong in our lives to make a difference here. And for me, I've always been a victim's advocate, and that's where my perspective comes from. So I want to apologize to my friends in this building who have worked very hard on this bill, who come from a different perspective. It is my hope that by the end of this legislative session, we will find a way to come together. Now, the reason I have reservations, but do support partial parts of this bill, Mr. Speaker, is because there is parts of this bill that are good for victims, and that was mentioned earlier by the previous speaker. And I do want to thank members of the organization that did work on this for considering this part of the bill. This is a very important part for the victim community, and we appreciate you for that. But I think what's really troubling with this bill, Mr. Speaker, and what worries a lot of victims who see this legislation, not just in Hawaii, but all over the nation who have been calling me about this, is that we are trying to base this model from the Texas model, which is very successful. But Texas is very different from Hawaii, Mr. Speaker. Texas is known as a law and order state that's been long tough on crime. Hawaii, unfortunately, we are not known as such, and we are known in contrast as having a reputation of being a little bit more tolerant for criminals. In our state, courts tend to give convicted criminals chance after chance on probation, before even sending them to prison. This has deeply troubled many victims of crime in Hawaii, Mr. Speaker. This is especially true for first-time offenders and even second-time and third-time felony offenders, Mr. Speaker. In other words, only the worst criminals actually end up in our prisons in the state of Hawaii. They ended up there as the last resort because they failed to take advantage of the multiple opportunities given to them along the way. Opportunities that gave them a chance to turn their lives around, to succeed in the community with the support of their probation officer and stay out of prison. That's exactly why Section 7 and 13 of this measure is so troubling to many victims in the state, Mr. Speaker. They seriously restrict the board discretion and authority of our parole board, the very people who are in the best position to decide if and when an offender is ready to be released back into the community. Section 7 puts a limit on how long a parolee has broken rules and can be sent back to prison for. And the previous speaker briefly mentioned that. I do want to mention, Mr. Speaker, that in the 1990s, we did try to do something very similar, not exactly the same, but we conducted a trial emergency release program in 1990s, where defendants on bail for $11,000 or less was released on the premise to appear with public supervision by the court. The city prosecutor's office was extremely opposed to this program, just like they are today, Mr. Speaker. The program was abolished at the end of the trial period because the failure to appear was greater than 50%. And that scares victims of crime in the state of Hawaii, Mr. Speaker, that we are trying to do this again. According to the 2011 annual statistical report of the Hawaii Paroling Authority, parole revocation hearings were held for 279 inmates from 2010 to 11. Of those 279 inmates, 275 were charged with committing technical violations of their parole, or 98.5% of the cases. Ultimately, 236 of the 279 inmates had their parole revoked and were sent back to prison. Obviously, these so-called technical violations can add up and be so serious that the parole board needs to put the offender back into prison. So I'm sure those are the complications. What's the motivation behind this, is those technical violations. But Section 13 is perhaps the most problematic portion of this measure, Mr. Speaker. Again, it's mandate to the parole board. It's a mandate to the parole board and ties their hands.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield my time.
So ordered. Please proceed, Representative Pine.
I apologize. In certain cases, the offender has prior felony convictions that make them repeat offenders who must serve a mandatory minimum prison term. Certain repeat offenders have such extensive criminal records that they are ordered to serve their full prison term with no possibility of parole. This is what's scary to these victims, Mr. Speaker. They are so dangerous that they need to be in prison and kept away from the public for as long as the law allows. This measure would completely do away with that. The measure would instead release the most serious offenders from prison and give them parole anywhere from 6 months to 18 months before the end of their sentence, no matter what. Before and if they have committed the most heinous crimes, Mr. Speaker, even they have demonstrated no interest in making any effort to rehabilitate themselves. Even if they have a history of running away from probation or a drug treatment program, even if they have a history of domestic abuse and stalking their victims the minute they get out of prison, no matter how many people they have hurt and how many rules they have broken, Mr. Speaker, this gives them freedom and a chance to hurt people again in the eyes of the victims who are concerned about this bill. And the parole board will have absolutely no discretion. Is this what we really want for our communities, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I'm especially concerned about victims of domestic violence or violence crimes. These victims can go about their daily lives counting on the fact that the perpetrator has been sent to prison and that they and their families are safe. They know that as long as the perpetrator is in prison, they can maybe feel like they can survive another day. They know it won't be forever, but at least they have some comfort knowing the perpetrator will be there for a good while. This measure changes all of that in the minds of the victims that I've been speaking to. It will let those perpetrators thumb their nose at the system by mandating their early release. The fact that the perpetrator will be on supervised parole isn't going to be any assurance to these victims. I had a woman who had a TRO against a man in Eva Beach, and she was hiding in my community, and he still found her, and he shot her in broad daylight. This brings chills down the spines of many victims that I know. Again, Mr. Speaker, while this measure has respectable long-term goals, and I hope we can figure this out by the end of session where we can all work together, the frightening truth is that it has an immediate effect on placing us, our families, and our fellow citizens at high risk. Risk of being victimized by offenders who are sent to prison for a good reason in the first place. So, fellow members, I apologize for this very long speech, but it was the best that I can do for the many women, especially that I'm working with, that oppose this measure strongly. Mahalo.
Thank you very much.